Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Richardson. I'm the Director of Intelligence and Child Safety with the Anti-Human Trafficking Intelligence Initiative, or Team ATII. And now I welcome Melissa Snow. Melissa is the Executive Director of the Child Sex Trafficking Program with the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC. Today, Melissa is going to share with us some new and emerging trends in child sex trafficking. Welcome and thank you for joining us today, Melissa.
Thanks so much, Matt. It is an honor to be here today with you and all of the individuals that have taken time out of their very busy schedules to join this conversation and presentation. I'm so grateful for you and ATII for hosting this incredible training and allowing me the opportunity to share the information that we have here at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children related to child sex trafficking and online safety. So we're going to go ahead and jump in. First, just a little background on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I know we have a really diverse audience here today of parents and teachers and law enforcement, child welfare, social services, and other child-serving professionals. And hopefully, many of you have already heard of the National Center, also known as NCMEC. But just a little background, we've been around for almost 40 years. We were developed out of an unfortunate tragedy where Adam Walsh, the son of John and Reve Walsh, was abducted from a shopping mall in Florida and later recovered deceased. However, out of that tragedy, the Walshes dedicated their life and still are to protecting kids and creating an entire network of safety for them that we are honored to carry on the legacy with at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. We are a nonprofit organization, and we're a little different because we are congressionally authorized and funded to operate 15 programs related to missing and exploited children. We are the National Resource Center for families, law enforcement, child welfare, and other child-serving professionals. While when you've heard of the term NCMEC, most often posters are what people think of first, and certainly they are our most visible component in terms of identification and response to kids that have gone missing. How those posters are made, the first step in that is by somebody, law enforcement, parent, or legal guardian, calling our hotline, 1-800-THE-LOST. We've received over 5 million calls related to this hotline, most of which connected to the intake of missing or exploited children. And as I mentioned, law enforcement, legal guardian, or parents can call in, and this is a 24/7, 365 hotline where specialists are always available to intake information or receive leads, tips, and sightings relating to active missing child cases. Another resource that I want to make sure people are aware of, and I'll certainly talk a lot more about these resources throughout the presentation, is our cyber tip line. So our cyber tip line is our electronic reporting platform for members of the public as well as electronic service providers to report in any type of child sexual exploitation. So some of the categories that we specifically are receiving intakes or information on is related to child sexual abuse material. Previously referred to as child pornography. The language has thankfully changed to better represent what those images are and the impact on the children that are being victimized in those images, as well as online enticement of children, child sex trafficking, child sexual molestation, and several other areas. But this is really the first line of defense for any information that somebody is aware of, has witnessed in their community, has seen something happening online, and they're not quite sure where to go with it. The cyber tip line is a great place to then share that information, report that information in. Everything is triaged internally by our specialized analysts, and then provided to law enforcement either in the jurisdiction or with the specialization to respond and look into these tips even further. All right, so now diving into the content of child sex trafficking. And I first want to start by unpacking a little bit of the myths and misconceptions that are out there. There's a lot of information that's available on the issue of human trafficking more broadly and of course, sex trafficking more specifically. But what I'd like for you to do is just pause for a minute and think about what comes to mind when you hear the term sex trafficking. And, if we were engaged, in a room, a conference space together, I would, want you all to be talking up and speaking up about the things that are coming to mind. But what I'll do today is mention some of the things that I commonly hear when we talk about this in group settings with various professionals as well as community members. Quite often people will reference media. So shows that they've seen that talk about trafficking, maybe it's Special Victims Unit or the movie Taken, or even Big Sky. I think there was another TV show or series that referenced trafficking more recently. The other thing that commonly comes up is imagery. And unfortunately, as you can see in this slide, when we Google human trafficking or even sex trafficking more specifically, a lot of the images that come up are really focused on victims being in cages, victims being bound or physically restrained. Quite often the imagery reflects, white, very young children, and also children that are being silenced in various ways. While these images are powerful and they are emotionally motivating and moving, they are very far from what we typically see on a day-to-day basis related to the targeting, recruitment, and the exploitation of trafficking. So we're going to unpack that a little bit more throughout our conversation today, but I think it's important to just know what's coming at you and be able to differentiate the reality from sometimes the fiction or the narrative that's being shared around child sex trafficking. So what is it then? When we talk about the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was passed in 2000 in the United States, and when we talk about how that term was defined, I think what's pretty incredible is that now over 20 years ago, when we were really first starting to figure out what trafficking looked like here in the United States, that those who crafted the definition of trafficking really got it right from the very beginning, especially as it relates to child sex trafficking. So of course, the definition has expanded over time as technology has expanded the way that trafficking occurs, and we understand a little bit more about the dynamics. But at its core, it's remained the same. And when we're talking about child sex trafficking, very simply stated, any child 17 years of age or under who's exploited through a commercial sex act is a victim of child sex trafficking. So the difference between adult sex trafficking and child sex trafficking is that for adults, the components of force, fraud, and coercion are required. So proof of these components is necessary for the crime of adult sex trafficking to exist. For kids, it's simply just the fact that they're being exploited. And the reason for that is because we know that minors cannot consent to being commercially sexually exploited. The next component is that movement is not required. Oftentimes people think of the term trafficking, and I think just the term in general sometimes conveys a expectation of movement, when in reality, a child can be trafficked because the commercial sexual exploitation is occurring, and the movement piece doesn't even need to occur. So they can be exploited in their own home, within their own community, and certainly not have to cross state-to-state borders or even international borders. What is a commercial sex act? We get this question quite a bit, and the piece that makes it different from sexual assault or rape, even though sexual assault and rape are components of the commercial sexual exploitation, is the fact that something of value is exchanged for that sexual assault or rape. And the something of value can be money, food, clothing, it can be drugs, it could be a hierarchy or a promotion. It really comes down to anything of value that is given to or received by any person within that commercial sex act. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means when we get into these components of different forms of trafficking. Within the narrative around trafficking, probably over the last 15 or so years, the narrative has primarily focused on one form of trafficking, which is the pimp-controlled trafficking narrative. And that is where there's a stranger, an individual who is not related to the child, that has targeted, recruited, and is involved in their exploitation. And there are very specific components related to pimp-controlled child sex trafficking that oftentimes get communicated. One of the things that we're really trying to do here at NCMEC is ensure that voices of all survivors are included when we're talking about what child sex trafficking looks like, and that we are representing as many forms of child sex trafficking that we're seeing to ensure that by excluding them, we are not creating a situation where a victim is misidentified or not identified at all because we're more narrowly looking at the crime. So I'm going to talk through very briefly some of these different forms of trafficking that we're seeing here at the National Center and a little bit of what that looks like. So as I mentioned, pimp controlled trafficking is an individual who's not related to the child, and they have specifically targeted them, whether in real life, at a grocery store, outside of a group home, at a train station, or they've targeted them online for recruitment. And then they've taken them through a process of grooming, which we'll talk through a little bit more later what that looks like, and then exploiting them through commercial sex. The next form of trafficking that we see quite frequently here at the National Center is gang-controlled trafficking. So last year, we had over 400 cases where a child was being actively exploited through child sex trafficking, had run away, and was reported missing to NCMEC. And we knew that there was some form of gang-controlled trafficking occurring in that child's life. So that's pretty significant, and we are seeing the trend increase. I don't know if that's because we're looking at it more specifically or whether these gangs are expanding their focus, but we know certainly that gangs are seeing child sex trafficking specifically as a very lucrative form of expansion of their legal activities, right? We know that guns and drugs and other means of financial gain through gang activity, once they sell the gun, once they sell the drugs, they have to go back and replenish that product before they can sell something again and increase their profit. With a child, unfortunately, they can sell them over and over and over again, and significantly increase the amount of money that they're making. So with gang control trafficking, we're seeing this play out in two main ways. One is that the entire gang and the organizational structure of that gang is including child sex trafficking in the illicit activity that they're involved in. In other scenarios, we're seeing gang members utilize their gang involvement as a way to intimidate and control trafficking victims, and it's something that they are doing slightly outside of their engagement with a gang. Familial trafficking is something that we've not seen talked about as much, but is a really extensive form of child sex trafficking that we know is occurring more broadly in the community. We don't see quite as much reported to the National Center because, unfortunately, if a family member is involved in that child sex trafficking, they're not likely going to be the one reaching out to law enforcement if their child does go missing. But familial trafficking, as it's stated or as it's implied, is a family member that's directly involved in the trafficking of their own biological children. And this can expand to a person who's perceived by the child as a family member. So, an auntie, an uncle, a cousin who has a direct family connection, and there's additional levels of control and dynamics of that make it harder for a young person to outcry. The difference with familial trafficking that we're seeing related to all the other forms is that oftentimes this starts much earlier in the child's life, certainly can be as early as a toddler or prepubescent, and that the creation of child sexual abuse material alongside that exploitation almost goes hand in hand in many cases. And then the last is buyer perpetrated. And this is a situation where there is not directly a third party controller or a trafficker. In these situations, a buyer or an individual that's looking to directly exploit the child is taking advantage of the vulnerabilities that that young person may have. So in these situations, we commonly see it manifest where a child has run away. Maybe they're homeless, they are couch surfing, they're living in a park, and this individual who is looking to exploit the child approaches them in a seemingly friendly way and says, hey, I see you're down on your luck. I've got a place, a couch you can crash at. Here, how about we go get something to eat? And after a few days of offering that type of what is viewed as generosity by the child, then that's when the switch is flipped. And it says, I've been offering this to you for free for a few days, a few weeks, whatever that looks like. And now I need you to do something for me. The intent the entire time by that buyer was to get to the exploitation, but they use the vulnerability as a method to get there. So just want to, and there's certainly obviously many other forms and ways that these types of trafficking look. However, these are the four main buckets that we're seeing at the National Center in the ways that this exploitation is manifesting. All right, so looking at some data. So certainly these are not intended to be prevalence estimates. We can only look at our data based on the reports that we are receiving. So either through our missing child intake or through our cyber tip line, where there's a nexus to potential child sex trafficking. But I think from the national perspective that we have, this does give some insight into risk factors and trends. So last year in 2022, 18% of the children who were reported missing to NCMEC that had run specifically from the care of child welfare were likely victims of child sex trafficking. So we see a really significant correlation between kids that have been taken into care, who have obviously previously experienced some type of exploitation or victimization in their home life that has caused their removal or some type of child protection intervention. Those kids then running away and then being targeted and recruited by traffickers. Last year, we received over 19,000 reports of possible child sex trafficking, and these reports were from every single jurisdiction across the United States, including the District of Columbia. And we mention that because sometimes, again, those myths and misconceptions can connect back to the idea that this only happens in big cities, or this only happens in areas like Las Vegas or New York City, when in reality, rural communities, smaller towns, as well as these big cities and big communities are experiencing this type of exploitation occurring. And then, of course, these cases reported to us include victims of all gender identities. Another statistic that I think is really important to share is about the risk factor in general of when kids have run away and or missing. So 1 in 6 of the children who ran away and then were reported missing to NCMEC were likely victims of child sex trafficking. So we know in general, one of the biggest risk factors is when a young person has left home, whatever the circumstances were, whatever they were running from or whatever they were running to, created a significant enough vulnerability that allowed for a trafficker to target and recruit. As we connect this to the role of the internet plays a significant role in all aspects along the life cycle of trafficking. So as I mentioned previously, that targeting component, while certainly some traffickers are inclined to reach out to individuals in their community to do that recruitment face-to-face at a mall, at again, a bus stop, a group home, whatever that may look like, many traffickers have shifted to utilizing the internet because they can essentially broaden the net that they're casting and are not geographically limited to only the individuals that they can have access into their own community. So they can essentially throw out fishing lines to states, to states that are further away and continue to do some of that recruitment pieces without having to even leave their own home. What they're looking for is, while certainly any kid can be targeted and recruited, what I really like to narrow in on is the components that create better opportunities or more likely opportunities that traffickers are going to bite on. And in this article that was put out there by the Washingtonian magazine, it really highlighted some of those pieces that traffickers are grabbing onto or looking for. And many of it has to do with kids that are putting information out there about issues that they're having in their life, things that they're frustrated with, really common, youth challenges, frustrations, and then some obviously more egregious, like if they're actually talking about a sexual assault that they experience, if they're talking about being removed from the home or taken into care, those risk factors are going to increase opportunity for traffickers to take advantage of. We also know that young people they put too much information out there in general, but they also are more likely to trust people more quickly online. And that's also because on the trafficker side or the predator side, they can create the persona that is more appealing to a young person online than they possibly can in person. So the likes, the things that they're into, can create a bond with that young person or some similarities that they otherwise would not be able to do in person. So whenever possible, I like to include advice from those with lived experience or survivors. So I have a video that I'd like to share with you that highlights from their perspective some of the vulnerabilities that they now realize that they had that were taken advantage of and how that was used against them.
I was 8 years old when I met my trafficker. He was classified as an uncle because he grew up with my uncles, not by blood, but the same age range they were. My trafficker was the person that was my mentor, classified as my mentor. He would help me with my homework.
I spent hours up and awake telling him about all my dying dreams and all the things that I wanted to see happen and everything that was so, a part of myself and my life and things that were important to me and things that I was worried about and things that I wanted to see happen and goals and dreams. And I mean, he got in my mind, and I think it really started there. It was the confinement of understanding everything about me, really being able to study me and really learn everything that was my vulnerabilities and being able to come in and take that away or make those issues bigger for me.
This guy said things that made me feel really good about myself. He said that I was too mature for high school, which every young girl in my circle was hoping to be seen as mature by an older guy. He said that I was pretty enough to be a model, which I don't know if I believed that or not, but I know that I wanted to believe it.
I had someone who wanted to fulfill every role. I needed the role of a father. I also needed the role of a boyfriend. I needed someone as a supporter. I needed some guidance. I needed someone to be a best friend, to listen to when I had things that are concerning. He kind of took on all multiple roles, He didn't appeal me in one way or another.
For the first time in a very long time, he made me feel like a person. He asked me things about myself, and he seemed to understand every situation that I was telling him about me being homeless. And he would say, I've helped girls out in your situation. You don't have to be homeless. You're too beautiful. He said that he could help me, and I believed him. He made me believe him.
So I think what they share in that piece is so powerful because it's a combination of the things that they were looking to get away from in many scenarios and the opportunities or the things that they were being lured into. And when and how specifically in each of those scenarios, these individuals, I mean, truly masters of manipulation, were working so hard to build, taking the time to listen, to build that rapport and that relationship, to collect the intel truly that they needed to develop the bond and the connection that they could later then use against that child. And so again, while we talk about, the fact that this is a kid and that kid is being put up against a predator whose entire intention is to manipulate and exploit, the reality is they're really looking for some of those increased vulnerabilities. So that fact of, experiencing homelessness, having that history of childhood sexual abuse, because predators know then there is a blurred line for that young person on healthy relationships, healthy adult interaction, sexual exploitation that's already been experienced and or is actively being experienced. If a young person is missing or has run away and is in families where there's domestic violence, severe substance abuse or misuse, or a family that is already engaged in some form of commercial sexual exploitation or activity. We often hear people talk about how youth who identify as LGBTQIA plus Two-Spirit are at a higher risk of being targeted or trafficked. And I do want to mention that it's not because of that particular gender identity or sexual orientation that creates the vulnerability. It is because that young person is experiencing some form of bullying, lack of acceptance, within their community or their family, or even more, challenging, has been kicked out by their family because of that sexual identity or gender orientation. And they and then are searching for acceptance, love, belonging in all of the places that create situations that could be unsafe. And so I want to clear that piece up, because I hear quite often people saying, you know, oh, there's these kids are at higher risk, and they're not at higher risk if they're in families that are loving and accepting, you know, because they're not oftentimes then pushed into these communities online where they have the opportunity to engage with a predator, or somebody has ill intent for them. You know, young people that have experienced mental health issues are system involved, or have been impacted by systemic racism, or in communities where that is something that is normalized, are at increased risk as well. And so when we talk about the grooming cycle, this applies to every form of trafficking that we talked about earlier, other than familial trafficking. Familial trafficking has a slightly different component, because they have to groom the child for the sexual abuse and exploitation, but they don't have to groom the child for the relationship, because that's already cemented, because this is their family dynamic. But when we're talking about pimp controlled trafficking, and especially gang involved trafficking, there really is this phase of specific targeting, again, whether in person or online, where they are learning about this young person. They're reading through their online activities, seeing their likes, their dislikes, seeing any issues that they're talking about, or hopes or dreams that they are expressing, and then using that information to then craft what their approach is going to look like. And quite often it's really just sometimes simple outreach to say, you know, whether it's you're pretty, or you're really talented in this, or something that really is connecting in a positive way with that young person. So there's an establishment usually of a friendship, and then oftentimes it transitions into what is a perceived loving or caring relationship, oftentimes romantic, but in some situations we've also seen where it's truly filling a mentorship, a family role, because that's what the young person was primarily looking for. And then all of that then is used against that young person. This can be days, it can be weeks, it could be months, before then the relationship shifts, and that young person is then told, you know, I've done all this for you, and now you have to do something for me. And then they're introduced to commercial sex, prostitution, stripping, in connecting them to that commercial sexual exploitation. And how do traffickers control their victims? I think this is important as well, because again, going back to the imagery that we talked about earlier, in many, many, many situations, these young people who are directly under the control of a trafficker are not being physically restricted. They feel physically restricted because of the amount of control, psychological control, violence, geographic control that they're putting over this young person, where they've taken them sometimes to a new city or location where the child doesn't know their way around, doesn't feel like they have individuals that they could reach out to for assistance. And certainly, you know, because of their age, don't oftentimes have the same capabilities to be able to get in a car, drive away, or take some of those more immediate actions. But a lot of it connects back to what we call trauma bonds, right? There is this significant period at the beginning, and that's why the grooming aspect is so important to understand, where the child is constantly thinking, this is just temporary, right? I have to do this for just a short period of time because I'm doing what I need to do to help. And then the relationship, the thing that felt so good previously, couldn't have been fake. And we will get back to that at some point. And that's constantly promised by the traffickers as well. And then you layer that with then the shaming and the blaming, and truly sometimes the lack of acceptance that they feel by people who have seen them be involved in this type of activity, that they feel like they don't belong any longer in what they view as like the square life, or the life of people who are outside of commercial sex. So as we kind of wrap up this piece of the presentation, and I'm going to shift into talking a little bit more about resources, I want to mention for those in the audience who are law enforcement or child welfare or other child serving professionals. There are tons of resources. When a case gets intaked into NCMEC and there is a connection to possible child sex trafficking, we have an entire child sex trafficking analytical team, an entire team that assists with recovery planning, that can provide support on these missing child cases or even investigations after the child has been recovered. And so, while I don't have time to get into all of that today, I do want to at least flag it. So if there is interest or if there's additional insight or resources that I can provide around that, please at the end, I'll provide you with my contact information and don't hesitate to reach out. So let's shift now to talking about how we protect the kids in our life. We certainly don't want any of this to happen to anybody that we know or care for or love, and certainly any young people. So what can we do to make an impact? So first and foremost, there are protective factors that can either prevent this from happening in a young person's life or make them more resilient to how to address it when it does happen. And some of those protective factors that are evidence-based is having a supportive family environment, understanding appropriate boundaries for what is healthy, healthy relationships, or even just healthy adult interaction, communication and trust among safe family members or among the larger community of family members, and fulfillment of basic needs. And this is both tangible needs, right? Shelter, food, clothing, but also intangible needs, love, belonging, and connection. And then caring and a safe adult. We know, unfortunately, not every young person has a biological family that provided them some of those protective factors. But we know by research that if a child has at least one safe, healthy adult in their life, it can create significant resiliency and protection. So I'm going to dive a little deeper into what some of these kind of very practical steps that we can take in your role as a professional and or your role as a parent or a concerned individual who has kids in your life that you have influence and connection to. When we talk about internet safety, some of the first things that we talk about is connecting and investing in your child's online space as you would their in-person friends, right? Making it normal to sit down with your child and literally go through, show me your app, show me who your friends are, who's this person? And not in a defensive way, but truly a curious way, right? I want to know where you're spending your time. I want to know who these people are in your life that you've decided are friends. And what does that person mean to you? What does that term friend mean in an online space, right? And unpacking that a little bit. Discussing and empowering your child to help develop appropriate ground rules. So certainly as adults, and especially as parents, right? I'm the parent of a 4-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 20-year-old. So lots of different conversations of online safety going on in various ways in our household. And, really inviting your kids, young people, into that conversation. So instead of saying, one of my rules is that no technology goes into the bedroom. And especially, for nighttime, technology, absolutely not in the bedroom. And so, but instead of saying that as a rule, right, we sit down with our teens and we say, what do you think would be an appropriate time in the evening that we all put our phones on the charger and we disconnect and get ready for bed? Right? And them saying, I think 9 o'clock, maybe 10, whatever the time frame they come up with. And then it's not us telling them what to do, but they've been engaged in the rulemaking process. And I find that to also be more effective in implementation, because then you can say, we came up with this together. Certainly safeguards. So, certainly parental restrictions, understanding parental restrictions, and also, utilizing monitoring software and things that are available both on the actual phone and then things that you can purchase to increase those safeguards. And then, as we talked about earlier, really discussing how much personal information is appropriate to share. Kids don't know this stuff intuitively. And, we know with adolescent brain development, their impulse control and what they put out there and they're not thinking about that before they just share that information. So the more we can talk about it in advance is going to be crucial. Learning the platforms, and look, I know as a parent, there are so many platforms out there and they're constantly changing. It is really hard to keep up with it. But again, asking your kids for help, right? Putting them in the driver's seat to teach you is such a great bonding opportunity, and really allows you to have some insight too on how they know how to use certain things and what they're using on the apps. Certainly reviewing the privacy and the parental settings as regularly as you can. And I love this one about building muscle memory. So there's been a lot of shift in the field about how we talk to young people in general about prevention activities, and the approach of not if it happens, but talking about when it happens. Because the reality is, when we say don't do this or don't share this photo, or this is what, it doesn't create a space for that young person when that happens to feel like they're not going to get in trouble. And so being able to say, when this happens, let's talk about how you're going to handle it. Let's talk about what you're going to do. Let's talk, and then walking through that process, and talking about it very frequently is incredibly empowering, because then young people know what is the appropriate next steps when these things happen. And then certainly we're always going to talk about teaching them about the cyber tip line, right? Empowering confidence in action as a part of those conversations, having them download, the link to the cyber tip line right there on their device, so that they know exactly where to go and how to enter that information, again, when something does happen that creates some unsafe scenarios. We've got incredible resources for you. I know sometimes having these conversations can feel really uncomfortable, and it's like, where do I even start? So we've got a starter kit for you. NetSmarts is a great place to start. There is information there that's all based on different age ranges, and also different who you are as the individual. So there's stuff in there for teachers, there's stuff in there for parents, there's stuff in there for friends, and it provides really a great toolkit. These are just some of a variety of resources that are on there. There's presentations, there's activity guides, there's online games, there's videos, all sorts of things that can create the opportunity to open up a dialogue in a little bit more comfortable way than just kind of directly asking about certain topics. For our slightly younger audience, so our kindergarten through maybe 10, we have this really cool resource called Into the Cloud. There's 2 seasons of it, and it is, as you can see, it's cartoon based, and they really tackle a lot of internet safety issues. And those are really fun episodes to watch together, and then just to talk about what did they take away from that, or what would they have done in that scenario. I'm going to skip kind of doing the preview of the trailer. But these cartoons are incredibly high quality, and I know that the young people that I've shared them with have really enjoyed watching them. For our slightly older, like our tween and teen, we have a resource on our website that is about, it goes through all of the different online social media platforms and applications, and we've worked with each of these companies to specifically get instructions from them on how to request the removal of sexual explicit content that's on their webs, that's on their platforms or sites. This can be really empowering for young people to know how and what type of action they can take to take control back of imagery of them that may have gotten out there, and they now want it taken down and removed. And the other resource that just launched, and I mean just a couple months ago, is this new resource called Take It Down. So while requesting imagery to be removed on the website is a direct request from the young person or in conjunction with a parent or legal guardian to the platform, and sometimes in those scenarios, the youth may not still have access to that image. So it was shared, they maybe deleted it, they don't have access to it anymore, and now it's being shared more broadly out there. In this Take It Down resource, this is an incredible resource for young people where if they have the image still available on their phone and it has been shared, or they're concerned that it might be getting shared out on platforms, they can go to this Take It Down resource. It's of nudes and sexually explicit images. Child sexual abuse materials should be addressed differently. And the image never leaves their phone. Essentially, when they load it into the application, it's hashed. The hash value is then shared with partner social media companies and organizations that are working with NCMEC on this. And that hash value is immediately screened through their platforms to remove any of those images immediately. and then is constantly running in the background. So if in the future that image is uploaded or shared, it will already be taken down before it can even get out on those platforms. So incredibly powerful for young people to have access to as well. And then certainly last but not least, if you're interested in any additional training on this topic, through our online learning platform, NCMEC Connect, we have tons of child sex trafficking resources. This introduction to child sex trafficking is available to anybody, and we have specialized training available for law enforcement as well as child welfare professionals. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Here's my contact information. And then a link to the location on our website where you can get additional details. Please don't hesitate to reach out if there's any questions that you have or anything I can provide beyond what was shared today. And I'm just so grateful for your time. I'm grateful for the work that you all are doing and for the efforts that you're making to make this world a safer place for young people. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Matt. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Melissa, for taking time out of a very busy schedule in the service and protection of all of our children. As a colleague and a friend and a parent, I greatly appreciate it. I can think of so many takeaways that I can begin to unpack and get my head around with this. It's such fantastic information. I suppose in the interest of time, I'll maybe hone in on one that I really feel is really valuable, is one of many, is the fact versus fiction. How many times I hear people talk about the movie Taken, and they'll say it's horrifying, and it is, but in my mind, I'm thinking so was Jaws or Nightmare on Elm Street. They're very exotic, and it's an entertainment piece, but it's such an exotic scenario. And my concern with it is we're looking for the wrong thing. We're looking for this exotic Liam Neeson scenario when it's so much more subtle and less emotionally jarring. But I find that makes it even more insidious because it can happen right literally in our homes and we don't know. So I have a question out of many, but I'll go with this one. If we, as a caring adult, a teacher, a daycare provider, someone that's in the service of children, we know that familial trafficking is really hard to detect, and it's typically the younger ones. Are there any red flags or indicators that either emotional and or physical that we might train our eyes for so that we know if we need to have a conversation with the child and potentially make a report to law enforcement and or NCMEC?
Absolutely. So thank you for that question. It's definitely something we've been talking a lot about at NCMEC, of what are some of the same indicators that are similar to other forms of trafficking, and what's different. I think one of the things, so I was just talking with a survivor of familial trafficking, and one of the things I said, who could have intervened, right? You're in this very closed network with your family. You weren't allowed to do extracurricular activities. You didn't have, and because of that, friends weren't allowed to come over to your house. You weren't allowed to go over to friends' houses. So a very narrow group of people that could intervene. And the thing that she shared was that teachers, the entire time that she was being exploited, she went to school. And that, how important teachers were in that particular conversation, and also just neighbors in the community. There was at least, she was outside of her home and, in the front yard, and there was, different things that people could have observed. I think a few of the things that stood out to me was this idea again of just some of the pieces that don't align with what a normal childhood should look like, right? So again, she wasn't going over to friends' houses. She wasn't allowed to have any friends over to her home. She didn't know how to play with kids. So her entire life was surrounded by adults, right? And inappropriate activity with young people. So whenever kids would ask her to play Red Rover or tag or things like that, she had no idea how to play those games. And also her interaction with adults, as well as especially other men, was oftentimes, sexualized in nature. And so I think some of those pieces stood out to me. Also for her, because there was such extensive photos and videos taken, there was a lot of discomfort when, school photos, group photos, other people wanting to take, photos of her and of, whoever, that there was a really significant reaction to that. So I think some of those things are helpful identifiers. But most importantly, the thing that she said that I thought was really powerful was, we can't wait for young people to find the right words to ask for help. That as adults, it's our responsibility to even just ask the question and say, something just seems a little off here. I just want to make sure that you're okay. And being able to lean into that, because it provides then the beginning of an opportunity for that young person to then ask for help, or validates the feeling that they're having that something's not right here.
What a thoughtful and incredibly insightful answer. And I've, honest to goodness, never once thought of nor heard those tips before. And that alone makes our time this morning on this session well worth its weight in gold to me. And one thing I do like about this question, or what we discuss here, is that this crime is horrible, and it can be overwhelming, feeling like, what can I possibly even do about this? And Melissa, one thing I take away from that, and I hope that we all do on the calls, we do not need to be law enforcement or SWAT team to have the ability to make an impact and a difference. In fact, we're all helpers. We need our eyes and ears open. We got to trust our gut and our instincts to do just as you so aptly recommended. Ask those questions, and where needed, seek the help on behalf of that child. And to me, that's empowering. I think one last thing I want to leave us with is, I've talked and taught about internet safety and things in that space for a while. For the longest time, there was no hope on, once the image is out there, it's always out there. And finally, with Take It Down and the help of NCMEC, that's no longer true. And I know one of the aspects that re-traumatizes survivors is that their images and content relive out there forever and ever in perpetuity. And I think it at least adds some comfort knowing that is not necessarily the case anymore, thanks to NCMEC and your partners.
Absolutely. I think that has definitely been our motivation, of that, knowing how survivors feel about that. One survivor recently just said to me that it's almost threefold. So the victimization happens, right? And a piece of you is taken because of that. Then when you know that the imagery is taken and that person leaves with that imagery, a piece of you is taken then. But then when you know that that image is being viewed over and over and over again, it's the ability to take control back over your life, even when you're working so hard to heal, feels just impossible. And so the idea that through these hash sharing lists, on the child sexual abuse material that we of course are doing in the background with the social media companies and platforms, but now this piece of giving young people the ability to take some of that control back, and remove those images before they even get out there, is so powerful. And we're really proud to be able to provide that.
Oh, well, thank you for one more time, all the thoughtful and super insightful advice, and frankly, the messages of empowerment and hope. With over 20 years in the field with NCMEC, previously the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I know I feel better for having attended this session myself, and I am very grateful for, again, your time and advice. Everyone, Melissa and I hope to see you a little bit later this morning. We will be having a live Q&A session where we can take questions and answer them live. You may submit them via chat. We will look forward to hopefully seeing you there. And one more time, thank you again, Melissa, and to all your colleagues at NCMEC. We really appreciate you and all your colleagues. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.